There's an old adage that goes something like this: wherever you go, there you are. I've always taken it to mean that you can travel the world trying to discover yourself, but it doesn't really matter where you go, because wherever you go, there you are. Same as ever, unchanged, just in a new place. So I was always trying to discover myself, always going to new places. I went to Africa to find myself. I went to the Middle East to find myself. Now, how I ended up in Austin, Texas is another story. But I arrived in Houston, culture shock proof in my eyes. I arrived in the early evening with a short break before the local flight to Austin. After a really scary landing, one of those white-knuckled, eye-popping, stroke-inducing landings, it was clear that there were weather issues. Now, for all my travels around the world, I'm not a good flyer. I still think that group willpower gets the plane off the ground and fervent prayer lands it. I have been known, when turbulence strikes and fear grips me, I've been known to hold the hand of fellow passengers so hard they wince with pain. I once threw my arms around the man sitting next to me and snuggled with him for over an hour, so great was my need for comfort. It was kind of embarrassing at that point, having to introduce myself. The thing was, Houston was engulfed in fog. Fog so bad that all flights were grounded and we were sent to hotels for the night. Now, the metaphor of being lost in the fog was not lost on me. And I hope that the irony of an English woman arriving in America on a foggy night is not lost on you. Americans are always teasing me about the weather. Everywhere I go, people tease me about the weather, particularly the fog. London smog, they say. Like a pea soup, they say. So thick you can cut it with a knife. But I am telling you, nothing compares with Houston fog. It's like an entity. It's an all-encompassing blanket of grayness, like something from a Stephen King novel. As we arrived, I couldn't see a single thing from the plane. So my first memory of America is of walking from the shuttle bus to the hotel and being soaked from head to foot before I even walked through the door. Now, I thought that I might be dripping with sweat because it was October and I'd heard that in Houston the temperatures could be in the 90s, but I didn't expect to be dripping with fog. In England, we're discombobulated by fog, disenchanted with fog, depressed even with fog, but we're never drenched with fog. Everybody said things were big in Texas, but I wasn't expecting big fog. Anyway, the next day, the sun was shining, the sky was blue, but for reasons connected with my luggage and the loss of it, I didn't actually set out for Austin until quite late the following afternoon and in the early evening. But here I was at last. Here I was. There was my friend Ellen to meet me, the only person I knew in America. Here I was in Austin, state capital of Texas. Well, as we waited for my luggage, I looked around me. Where were all the guns I'd heard so much about? Everywhere I'd ever lived, people talked about America and its guns. The murder rate, the availability of guns, the number of prisons required to accommodate misguided gun users. These were subjects the rest of the world talked about all the time. Now, of course, I wasn't expecting everyone to be carrying automatic weapons, but I did expect to see handguns in holsters. And I've lived in some scary places, believe me, but I'd never lived anywhere where ordinary citizens were allowed to carry firearms. But there wasn't one, not one single gun to be seen. Where were they then? I found myself staring at body parts, just looking at people, looking at their handbags, their trouser legs. Where were the guns? I looked at Ellen. Did she have a gun? I didn't want to ask her. It might upset her. It might embarrass her. She might shoot me. Well, anyway, we gathered my luggage together. We put it on the cart and we headed towards the door. Standing at the exit, there was a policeman, just generally keeping an eye on proceedings. And he had a gun in a holster. My first, totally visible to the human eye, ready to shoot me, American gun. And I thought about English policemen who aren't allowed to carry guns. I thought about them with their truncheons, you know, those black sticks they carry to ward off the angry mob, and I realized how charmingly pathetic they must seem to Americans. I found myself staring at the policeman's gun. I couldn't take my eyes off it. All of a sudden, the policeman put his hand on his holster. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he said. I giggled like a silly schoolgirl, and I was through that door like a bat out of the proverbial into the blinding sunlight of an October evening in Austin. Now, I don't know quite what I was expecting as I came out into the big wide world. I thought I was culture shock proof, as I said, and I didn't realize I had any preconceived ideas until the gun incident. But I must say I thought there would be more hats. And by hats, I don't mean baseball caps, backwards or otherwise, and I don't mean straw hats or sombreros or big flowery church hats. No, by hats, I mean Stetsons, 10-gallon hats, cowboy hats. There wasn't one, not one single cowboy hat to be seen. Had I landed in the right state? Wasn't this Texas? Wasn't this cowboy country? Well, I was still searching for a John Wayne look-alike when my friend Ellen asked me what I wanted for supper. And frankly, I was a little disappointed that there was no hoedown to meet me and no fiesta in my honor. But I said, well, what food was available? Where should we go? And she said, well, there were lots of good restaurants in town, or we could get a bucket of chicken to go. A bucket of chicken? Well, I was picturing a large metal pail with a dead rooster hanging out of it. And then Ellen told me about KFC and churches and their big containers of fried chicken. Well, by this time, she'd pulled into a 7-Eleven, and she was pumping gas, and I glanced towards the door, and I saw a young man come out of the 7-Eleven, and he got a large plastic container. And I thought, a bucket of chicken. Ellen, look, that guy's got a bucket of chicken. Nope, that's a big gulp. Now, at first, I couldn't work out how much drink there would be in a 64-ounce container. But then I remembered my mother's Pyrex measuring jug. 16 ounces equals 1 pint. So 64 ounces is 4 pints. 2 quarts. Oh, that poor boy was going to try and drink half a gallon of Coca-Cola. Ooh, that sounded like some sort of torture to me. Don't you have to drink 64 ounces of Gatorade when you have a colonoscopy? Ooh. Well, if I drank 64 ounces of highly caffeinated soda, I'd be able to swim the Atlantic faster than Wonder Woman. I'd win Olympic gold at the 10,000 meters. Oh, I'd be able to knit you a sweater in 8 minutes. And I can't even knit. Well, we ended up in Threadgill's, which is, as any Austinite will be able to tell you, something of an Austin tradition, a Southern-style restaurant. Janis Joplin cut her teeth there in the 60s. It got the first beer license in 1933, the first beer license in the county. Now, Americans are always calling English things quaint, but to me, Threadgill's was quaint and a bit, well, shabby. A coat of paint wouldn't have gone amiss. The crockery was mismatched. The cutlery was cheap-looking. Well, of course, Austin is a town of hippies. Austin, well, shabby is its middle name. Austin knew that shabby was chic before shabby chic was fashionable. Well, you've got to remember, I had been traveling for about 2 days by this point. I was disgruntled before disgruntled was fashionable. I was hot and tired and irritable. I wanted fish and chips. I wanted apple crumble and sweet yellow custard. I wanted a cup of tea. Actually, I wanted my mummy. Well, I looked at the menu. Through tear-filled eyes, actually, and I saw that on it there was something called catfish and French fries, which looked a little bit like fish and chips. And there was something called apple cobbler à la mode, which looked a little bit like apple crumble and custard. And I was just looking for the Texas equivalent of a nice English cuppa when a waitress arrived. "Iced tea, hun," she said, and she put a big glass in front of me, dripping with condensation. And alongside it on the table, a basket of sweet-smelling breads wrapped in a bright white and red checkered napkin. Well, I took my first bite of succulent southern cornbread and my first sip of sweet Texas tea. And all of a sudden, everything looked better. All of a sudden, things seemed a little different, just a little better all round. All right, I thought. In my attempts at self-improvement, I managed 2 years in Africa, 5 years in the Middle East. I think I can manage 1 week in Austin, Texas. This is as good a place to start as any. And as I reached for a second piece of cornbread, and I took a second sip of my Texas tea, I could feel myself smiling. I could feel that new leaf turning, and I knew that I was a clever